There's a moment when distance shows up, communication fades, and everything in you wants to react, to chase, to fix, to demand clarity. But that instinct often pushes things further away instead of bringing them closer. What if the real power isn't in doing more, but in doing less, strategically? This is about understanding a different approach, one that shifts the dynamic without forcing it. When distance appears, the immediate instinct is to react, to send a long message, to ask what went wrong, to demand clarity, or to express everything all at once. That reaction feels natural because it's driven by emotion, especially confusion, anxiety, or fear of losing connection. But acting in that emotional state usually creates the opposite result of what's intended. Instead of bringing things closer, it adds pressure. And pressure is exactly what pushes someone further away when they're already pulling back. What actually creates a shift is the ability to pause, not suppressing emotions, but choosing not to act on them immediately. There's a difference between feeling something and reacting to it. In that space between feeling and action is where control exists. When you slow down your response, you prevent yourself from saying things you might regret, or from showing desperation that weakens your position. It allows you to observe the situation more clearly rather than reacting blindly to it. Emotional reactions often come with urgency, the need to fix everything right now. But not every situation requires an instant response. In fact, giving things time can reveal more than immediate action ever could. When you don't rush in, you give the other person space to process, and you also give yourself the chance to regain emotional balance. That calm state changes how you communicate later, making your words more intentional instead of reactive. Resetting your energy is about grounding yourself before doing anything externally. That might mean stepping away from your phone, distracting your mind with something productive, or simply sitting with your thoughts until they lose their intensity. When your emotions settle, your perspective shifts. What once felt urgent may no longer feel necessary, and what once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. This approach isn't about ignoring the situation or pretending not to care. It's about responding from a place of control rather than emotion. When you master that, your presence feels different. You come across as composed, self-assured, and not easily shaken. And that kind of energy doesn't push people away. It draws respect and changes the entire dynamic without needing to force anything. The moment someone pulls away, there's a strong urge to move closer, to send another message, to check in again, to try harder so the connection doesn't fade. It feels logical in the moment. If something is slipping, you hold on tighter. But in reality, that instinct often backfires. Chasing doesn't restore connection, it creates imbalance. One side starts giving more, asking more, needing more, while the other side feels that weight and instinctively steps back even further. When you stop chasing, you interrupt that pattern. You're no longer feeding the dynamic that creates distance in the first place. Instead of trying to close the gap immediately, you allow space to exist. And that space isn't a loss, it's actually where clarity begins. Without constant messages or pressure, both sides have room to think, to feel, and to understand what's really going on beneath the surface. Creating space also shifts your position. When you're chasing, your energy is outward, focused entirely on someone else's actions and reactions. You start measuring your worth based on their responses, whether they reply quickly, show interest, or give attention back. But when you pull your energy inward, that dependency starts to break. You're no longer waiting or reacting, you're simply existing without needing constant reassurance. There's also a psychological effect to space that most people overlook. When someone no longer feels pursued, the absence becomes noticeable. It creates contrast. What was once constant is suddenly quiet, and that silence invites curiosity. Instead of feeling pressured, the other person has the freedom to reflect, and sometimes that reflection leads them to re-engage on their own terms. Not because they were pushed, but because they chose to. This doesn't mean disappearing completely or playing games. It's not about ignoring or punishing. It's about removing the pressure that comes from overextending yourself. You're still present, but not over-available. You're still open, but not chasing. That balance changes how you're perceived, from someone seeking validation to someone who naturally has value without needing to prove it. In the end, creating space isn't about losing connection. It's about giving it the right conditions to either grow naturally or reveal its true state. And either outcome is more powerful than forcing something that isn't moving on its own. Blocking can feel like taking control in a moment that feels out of control. It gives a quick sense of relief, like you're drawing a line and protecting yourself from further disappointment. But most of the time, that decision is driven by emotion rather than clarity. It's a reaction to discomfort, not a move rooted in confidence. And while it may create temporary distance, it doesn't actually resolve anything internally. It just cuts off the situation without processing it. When you choose not to block, you're not saying that everything is okay or that you accept being treated poorly. You're showing that your actions aren't dictated by emotional spikes. There's a difference between setting boundaries and reacting impulsively. Blocking, in many cases, is abrupt and final. It removes all access, all possibility, and often leaves things unresolved on both sides. Staying unbothered, on the other hand, keeps your composure intact while still maintaining your sense of control. There's also a subtle but powerful message in not reacting dramatically. When you don't block, don't lash out, and don't try to prove a point, it signals stability. It shows that you're not easily shaken or dependent on constant interaction to feel secure. That kind of calm presence stands in contrast to emotional reactions, and people notice that difference more than words. Silence, when it's intentional, carries weight. Remaining unbothered doesn't mean you ignore your feelings or pretend they don't exist. It means you don't let those feelings dictate your behavior. You can feel disappointed, confused, or even hurt, and still choose to act with control. That's where real strength shows up. Not in cutting someone off instantly, but in holding your ground without needing to make a scene or prove anything. Another important aspect is that blocking often closes the door in a way that's fueled by the moment, not by long-term thinking. Sometimes situations shift, people reflect, or clarity emerges with time. When everything is shut down impulsively, there's no room for that evolution. By staying unbothered instead, you keep your dignity intact while allowing things to unfold naturally without forcing a permanent decision in a temporary emotional state. In the end, not blocking is less about the other person and more about you. It's about maintaining control over your own reactions, choosing composure over impulse, and showing that your peace doesn't depend on dramatic actions. That quiet confidence speaks louder than any sudden move ever could. When your attention is fixed on someone else, especially when they're pulling away, it's easy to lose your center. Your thoughts start revolving around what they're doing, why they're distant, and what you should do next to fix it. That constant focus drains your energy and keeps you stuck in a loop where your mood depends on their behavior. The more you invest your attention there, the less you have for yourself, and that imbalance slowly erodes your sense of control. Shifting your focus back to yourself isn't just a distraction tactic, it's a reset. It's a deliberate decision to stop pouring energy into something you can't control and start investing it into areas of your life that actually move you forward. That might mean strengthening your routine, focusing on your work, improving your physical health, or simply doing things that bring a sense of progress and stability. These aren't just activities, they rebuild your independence. As your attention returns to your own life, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You start remembering who you were before the situation took over your mind. Your identity becomes less tied to someone else's presence or absence, and more rooted in your own actions and direction. That shift reduces the emotional weight of the situation. It no longer feels like everything depends on what happens next, because your life continues moving regardless. There's also a psychological shift in how you perceive validation. When your focus is outward, you're constantly looking for signals, messages, responses, signs of interest to feel secure. But when you're grounded in your own progress, that need starts to fade. You're no longer waiting to feel chosen or acknowledged because your sense of worth isn't tied to someone else's attention. It becomes internal, stable, and far less reactive. Interestingly, this shift doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how you're perceived. When you're no longer chasing or seeking reassurance, your presence feels different. You come across as more self-contained, more focused, and less dependent. That kind of energy naturally draws attention, not because you're trying to get it, but because you're no longer giving it away so freely. It creates a contrast that people notice without you needing to say anything. Focusing on yourself is not about detaching completely or pretending the situation doesn't matter. It's about reclaiming your time, your energy, and your direction. You're choosing to build a life that doesn't pause for uncertainty. And in doing so, you place yourself back in control, not of the other person, but of the only thing that truly matters, your own path forward. When you stop chasing and step back, something subtle begins to shift, not through force, but through absence. What was once constant becomes quiet, and that quiet has an effect. People are naturally wired to notice change, especially when it comes from something they had grown used to. When your presence is no longer predictable, it creates a gap, and that gap often turns into curiosity. Curiosity doesn't come from pressure. It doesn't grow when someone feels overwhelmed or pursued. It develops when there's space to think, to wonder, and to question. When you're always there, always initiating, always trying to keep things alive, there's no room for that process to happen. Everything feels certain, even if it's one-sided. But when you pull back, uncertainty replaces that certainty, and uncertainty is what makes people start paying attention. Instead of asking yourself what they're thinking, the dynamic slowly flips. They begin to notice the shift, the lack of messages, the absence of effort that was once there. It stands out. And that absence often leads to internal questions. Why the change? What happened? What does it mean? Those questions don't need to be planted with words. They arise naturally when behavior changes. This is why letting curiosity do the work is more effective than trying to convince or explain. Words can feel heavy, especially when someone is already distant. But silence, when it's intentional, creates room for interpretation. It allows the other person to fill in the blanks on their own, and people tend to assign more value to conclusions they reach themselves than to things they're told directly. At the same time, this approach requires patience. Curiosity doesn't always appear instantly, and it can't be forced. If you keep checking, breaking your own space, or looking for immediate results, you interrupt the very process you're trying to create. The power of this shift lies in consistency, maintaining your distance without turning it into a tactic or a game. It's also important to understand that curiosity doesn't guarantee a specific outcome. Sometimes it leads to renewed interest, sometimes it simply brings clarity about where things stand, but in either case it moves the situation forward in a more natural way than chasing ever could. You're no longer trying to control the outcome, you're allowing it to reveal itself. In the end, letting curiosity take over isn't about manipulating someone's thoughts. It's about stepping out of the way and letting human nature respond to change, and often that quiet shift creates more movement than anything you could have said or done directly. When distance has existed for a while and then communication suddenly returns, it's easy to slip back into old patterns. There's a sense of relief, sometimes even excitement, and that emotional surge can make you forget everything that created the imbalance in the first place. You might feel the urge to respond quickly, give more attention, or act as if nothing happened just to keep things smooth. But this is exactly the moment where awareness matters most. If the dynamic is going to change, it has to change here, not when things are quiet, but when they start moving again. Responding with the same energy as before often recreates the same outcome. Overgiving, over-explaining, or immediately becoming fully available can bring back the same imbalance that led to distance earlier. That's why staying grounded is key. It's not about being distant or cold, but about staying centered and measured in how you engage. Being grounded means you don't let temporary attention dictate your behavior. You take your time to respond. You stay consistent with the space you created earlier. You don't rush to fill every gap or jump at every opportunity to reconnect. This steadiness shows that your actions aren't driven by impulse anymore, but by intention. It communicates that your time and energy have value, and they're not given away automatically. It also means observing, not just reacting. When communication resumes, pay attention to patterns rather than just moments. Words can be reassuring, but behavior over time is what actually defines the situation. Staying grounded allows you to notice whether things are genuinely different or simply repeating in a familiar cycle. Without that awareness, it's easy to get pulled back into something that hasn't really changed. Another important part of this is maintaining your own life and priorities. Just because someone reappears doesn't mean everything else should pause. Keep your routine, your focus, and your independence intact. When your life continues moving forward, regardless of someone's presence, it naturally creates a healthier balance. You're engaging from a place of choice, not from a place of need. Staying grounded also protects your emotional stability. Instead of riding the highs of attention and the lows of distance, you remain steady. That emotional consistency makes you less reactive and more in control of your decisions. It ensures that your actions align with what you actually want long term, rather than what feels good in a fleeting moment. In the end, being ready for the return isn't about expecting it or relying on it. It's about being prepared to handle it differently if it happens. The goal isn't just to reconnect, it's to create a dynamic that's more balanced, more respectful, and more stable than before. And that only happens when you stay grounded enough to not lose yourself the moment things start to feel good again.